name's Dan Chartrand. I'm the owner of Water Street Bookstore, and I'm so pleased to have a book by Douglas Rooks that we're talking about tonight. The book is Statesman, George Mitchell and the Art of the Possible. And George Mitchell is a former senator from a neighboring state and had an amazing career, continues to have an amazing career. I'm just going to read a short bio of Douglas and then turn the podium over to him. Douglas Rooks is a career journalist who worked for weekly and daily newspapers for 25 years. He served as editor of the Granite State News in Wolfeboro, right here in New Hampshire, editorial page editor for the Kennebec Journal in Augusta, Maine, and editor and publisher of Maine Times. He's now a freelance editor and writer. He covers Maine state government, specializing in environmental issues, public education, municipal affairs, business, and tax policy. He's also a magna cum laude graduate of Colby College, so he's got his Maine chops down. And he's a former board president of the Unitarian Universalist Community Church in Augusta. He lives with his wife in West Gardner, Maine, and this is his first book. Please join me in welcoming Douglas Rooks to Water Street Bookstore. Doug, thank you so much.
Well, it is great to be back in New Hampshire. You know, that's what politicians do. But it really is. New Hampshire is where I started my journalistic career, and as most of you know, journalism and politics are really intimately connected in many ways. And so, yeah, I cut my teeth on covering New Hampshire races, and it's been kind of a natural thing to move on to George Mitchell. So anyway, because we are in New Hampshire, and because this was an idea that Dan came up with, we're going to look at the, what I'm calling, well, here's the title, George Mitchell and John Sununu, The Last Budget Deal. And it turns out that really was. It was the last time both parties, Republicans and Democrats, collaborated to come up with a budget agreement. So I will start in, and this is mostly from the chapter called The Bedrock of Government. But there are excerpts from other scripts, and there's some material that I summarized from John Sununu's book. Sununu was the chief of staff for George H.W. Bush, and he played a pretty significant role in this chapter. So he's here as well. Presidents are supposed to bring their agendas before the people, but that's not expected of Senate Majority Leaders. With their managerial roles paramount, and given the Senate's uniquely fractious nature, most Senate leaders have little time or energy to devote to thinking about the course of the nation. George Mitchell did so, however, and set himself the unenviable but essential task of putting federal finances back in order after a decade in which they had veered alarmingly out of control. The Reagan tax cuts and defense buildup created an annual deficit in peacetime, the likes of which had never been seen before. And most of Washington, including the next president, George H.W. Bush, appeared uninterested in doing anything about it. Over the next 6 years, Mitchell led efforts under two different presidents to restore the federal budget and the national economy to balance, and he succeeded. Mitchell believed above all in fiscal prudence. He was not drawn to tax cuts or tax increases and was skeptical of both. He had strong views about what constituted a fair system of taxation, but he also saw taxation not as an isolated issue as Ronald Reagan had, but as the necessary support for the national government's programs and commitments. In a floor speech, he quoted George Washington at the end of his presidency in 1796 in the famous farewell address, who said there, "Toward the payment of debts there must be revenue, that to have revenue there must be taxes, that no taxes can be devised which are not more or less unpleasant and inconvenient." So that was George Washington. Fiscal responsibility was not only good policy, but good politics, Mitchell believed. In a speech to the AFL-CIO on February 20th, 1989, Mitchell said, "We Democrats continue to lose presidential elections while winning congressional and gubernatorial elections. And I believe that one of the reasons for that inconsistency is that state and congressional Democrats have continued to identify with the economic aspirations of average Americans, while presidential Democrats have not. and added, "The presidential Democratic Party has come to be seen as the party that does not put economic growth high on its priority list." Mitchell had also said, "The New Deal and the Reagan reaction to it are over." He may have been premature about that latter assertion, but he continued to draw inspiration from the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt's astute management both of the political system and the economy. After his appointment to the Senate in 1980, Mitchell sought and won appointment to the powerful Finance Committee, just in time for the committee's review of the Reagan tax cuts of 1981, which reduced the top income tax rate from 70 to 50% and cut revenues 25% across the board. His first Finance Committee aide was Tom Gallagher, a veteran Senate staffer from South Dakota. Gallagher said Mitchell didn't have a natural bent for Finance Committee work. "Economics wasn't really his strong suit, so I probably had more freedom to roam. Obviously, being the lawyer and judge that he was more drawn to those kind of issues and foreign policy, and less drawn to the core economic issues." 4 years later, Gallagher moved to the International Trade Commission and was replaced by Bob Rosen, who had served on the personal staff of Senator Wendell Ford from Kentucky, who was later to become Majority Whip for the last 4 years of Mitchell's tenure as Senate Majority Leader. Rosen found a senator much more experienced in fiscal matters by the time he joined the staff in 1984. Rosen was particularly impressed by the way Mitchell operated on the Senate floor, saying, "There were times when I would write a floor speech or a statement for the committee, and I wouldn't be convinced of what the arguments were. But when I heard it given, I would be convinced." He had a voice that had a lot of gravitas in it. After Reagan's re-election, Rosen documented the existing and future consequences of the administration's economic policies, marked by significant domestic spending cuts but much larger defense increases and, of course, mammoth tax cuts, truly the largest in history. For fiscal 1982, the deficit was $45 billion, $17 billion higher than the Carter administration's blueprint. The following year, the deficit doubled to $92 billion. The third Reagan budget doubled the deficit again to $189 billion. The Congressional Budget Office projected $200 billion deficits as far as the eye can see, and some second-term deficits were even larger. In a memo to Mitchell, Rosen wrote, "It is no mystery why President Reagan has yet to propose a balanced budget. Most observers agree that any real solution to the deficit problem will require revenue increases and a slowdown in the Reagan military buildup, as well as continued restraint on domestic spending. If revenues are not increased and military spending growth is not slowed, balancing the budget will require virtually dismantling most of civilian government." Rosen then commented on Reagan's latest proposal, the balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. "Having no constructive plan to offer, President Reagan and his Republican allies have instead opted for a political ploy, their current media campaign for a balanced budget amendment." He concludes, "Despite all the Republican rhetoric and fancy television advertisements, the basic fact remains that solving the deficit problem does not require amending the Constitution. The way to solve the problem is to formulate a plan for balancing the budget and then to implement that plan. So far, President Reagan has refused to take the first step." The balanced budget amendment remained part of Republican campaigns for years and was a key element in Newt Gingrich's 1994 contract with America. The Reagan deficits were truly unprecedented in peacetime. The last surplus was in Lyndon Johnson's final budget. From 1970, when the deficit was $2.8 billion, it increased sharply by 1975 to $53.2 billion under Richard Nixon. Nixon's deficits were $70 billion over 5 years. Amid stagflation, Gerald Ford ran deficits of $180 billion for 3 years. The 8 years of Ronald Reagan's budgets produced $1.4 trillion in deficits. During the debates that led to comprehensive tax reform in 1986, the last such reworking of the federal tax code, Mitchell tried hard to create a more progressive rate structure in the income tax, which was dramatically flattened to create a top rate of just 28%. He proposed what became known as the Mitchell Amendment that led to an all-day Senate debate, but failed in the end in part because part of the Democratic caucus decided to stick with the deal that the Finance Committee had already approved. When he became majority leader in 1989, however, he beat back a Republican effort strongly supported by President George H.W. Bush to lower the capital gains tax, a move virtually everyone thought would succeed. The Wall Street Journal, poles apart from Mitchell on tax policy, nonetheless published an admiring front-page feature story headlined, "Mitchell Defeats Capital Gains Cut Almost by Himself." It began, Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell lay down on the tracks in front of the capital gains freight train, and he has walked away with a smile. Until recently, the low-key lawmaker was criticized for being too accommodating to President Bush. Not anymore. Through a combination of cajolery and commitment bordering on obsession, the Maine Democrat fought the White House's proposed cut in capital gains taxes and won. By this time, Mitchell's skills on economic issues had advanced to the point where his last Majority Office Chief of Staff, John Hilley, called them unbelievable. He had a clear, analytic mind and a very reasoned way of approaching everything. But he was also incredibly numerate, so that quantitative issues were easy for him. So there was never this issue of, I don't understand, or do that again. He was very easy to deal with. I was very fortunate to have a boss who was smarter than I am. Mitchell had been unimpressed when President Bush presented his first budget in January 1989. A new president usually introduces his most important programs there, but there was little in the Bush budget that differed from the Reagan blueprint. Bush had said in his inaugural address that the nation had more will than wallet, but there was no plan to combat a rising and chronic deficit that the Reagan tax cuts and military buildup had created. On the budget, Bush punted. There was no relief from budget pressures as 1990 began, the next year. Mitchell had found Bush's 1989 budget proposal unsatisfactory and the new one no better. The deficit problem that had been ignored the previous year ended up taking up most of 1990 to resolve. Not everyone thought the deficit would be a high priority. Congressional Quarterly had summed up conventional wisdom by saying, "The last thing anyone expects George Bush to do as president is balance the federal budget. Chances are he won't try." A year later, though, things had changed. Congress had now agreed, though with dismay, that the savings and loan crisis could only be resolved by a federal bailout. The agreement, which Mitchell shepherded through a reluctant Senate roiled by the Keating 5 scandal, called for $50 billion in the next budget, declining in subsequent years. The administration wanted the S&L funding off budget, meaning it wouldn't count against the deficit. Democrats said S&L funding was a regular budget item. A compromise was reached that put $20 billion on budget and the rest off budget. Mitchell's performance won him plaudits from Bush's Treasury Secretary, Nicholas Brady, who said, "Your efforts were instrumental in ensuring that the legislation was kept on track with its essential reforms intact." Brady added a handwritten note saying, "You are a leader. This note comes with thanks for your intensity and understanding," and was signed, Nick. Another factor prompting deficit reduction efforts was that the Graham-Rudman Budget Act was beginning to bite. The law, also co-sponsored by Democrat Fritz Hollings, who got left off the shorthand version, set a series of deficit targets. While no one knew whether Congress could actually meet them, disregarding them could be politically perilous. The next target was $100 billion. While the administration projected a deficit of $116 billion, a manageable number, the Congressional Budget Office estimated $141 billion, which was not. And in Congress, the CBO numbers were what counted. In the end, the deficit was higher than either estimate. The resulting sequestration would have cut deeply into both domestic and defense spending. Within the Bush administration, there were three officials who dealt directly with Mitchell on the budget: Dick Darman, the budget director; John Sununu, the chief of staff; and Treasury Secretary Nicholas Brady. The big issue for Mitchell was Bush's "Read My Lips" pledge, made repeatedly during the 1988 campaign, that he would never sign a tax increase. While initially a tactic to win over reluctant Republicans, Bush had faced both Bob Dole and Jack Kemp in the primary. It was considered sacrosanct by Sununu, a former New Hampshire governor, where taking the pledge had become part of the state's political DNA. Darman and Brady were more agnostic about tax increases, without which Mitchell had decided there could be no deal. Darman was the stronger personality, but Brady was close to the president. The dynamics among the three of them would be critical as the debate continued from mid-May through late October. The first step since the White House sent conflicting signals was a meeting with key congressional leaders, including from the Senate, Jim Sasser, the Budget Committee chair, and Weiss Fowler from Appropriations. Those meetings got nowhere for a familiar reason that was summed up by Sununu. He said of congressional leaders, if they want to come to the table and say they put tax increases there, it is their prerogative to put them on the table, and it's our prerogative to say no. And I emphasize the no. Darman came to see Mitchell to explain a possible agreement. The two got along well. Mitchell said of Darman, he was highly intelligent, articulate, with a wry sense of humor and an occasionally sharp tongue. He told Mitchell that when the leadership group assembled, out of this discussion, a tax increase will emerge. When Mitchell asked him to explain, Darman, Mitchell said, fluttered his hand in a rising fashion and said, well, it will just emerge. Mitchell fluttered back and said, I don't think this is good enough. We want to know what does the president propose because we're concerned that you guys are going to play a political trick on us. And so it went. On June 20th, Darman announced a new proposal, but, said Mitchell, the only thing new in it was the insertion of the word new in the description. It was a discouraging time. Bob Rosen, his finance aide's handwritten notes from one leadership summit recorded, President doesn't want to do anything. Complete failure of presidential leadership. Won't go to people or propose a plan. Doesn't want to be involved in the process. Rosen also believed the White House thought that Democrats' insistence on tax increases paired with spending cuts would crack over time, but it didn't. Mitchell made sure of it. Finally, Mitchell got a call at 6 a.m. one morning from Sununu. It was June 26th, who asked him to come to breakfast at the White House. Mitchell soon found out that Tom Foley, the House Speaker, and Dick Gephardt, House Majority Leader, were also attending. Mitchell was hosting a lunch at the Capitol before Nelson Mandela's address to a joint session of Congress, but he accepted Sununu's invitation without hesitation. At 7:30, they had breakfast with the White House team, Bush, Darman, Brady, and Sununu. Mitchell suggested that the House Speaker Foley and Majority Leader Gephardt ride up to the White House with him, and by the time they got there, they had a strategy. Tom Foley, who some suspected was the weak link on the Democratic side, presented the congressional position. The two sides exchanged briefs, which Mitchell said was very cordial and civil. Then the president said to Darman and Sununu, why don't you go into the next room and draft up a statement? They were gone only briefly, so Mitchell figured the statement had been prepared earlier. It included the phrase, tax revenue increases. When it was presented, and before anybody said anything, Mitchell said, Mr. President, this is very positive, but I would like a few minutes. He, Foley, and Gephardt caucused. Mitchell thought, they're trying to get away with finessing it. And he told Foley and Gephardt they think they can explain it away. So the congressional leaders agreed on a counteroffer. When they returned, Mitchell told Bush that this is not a statement by the president, despite its headline saying that it was, and he limited references to we to make that clear. The crucial sentence in the original read, it is clear that both the size of the deficit problem and the need for a package that can be enacted require all of the following: entitlement and mandatory program reform, tax revenue increases, growth incentives, discretionary spending reductions, orderly reductions in defense expenditures, and budget process reform. Though the sentence included tax revenue increases, Mitchell added a caret to the first part and inserted to me, so that the statement now read, it is clear to me, meaning the president. And another change, altering the statement that budget negotiations should reconvene to will resume. All parties endorsed the wording, though the statement remained unsigned. Mitchell asked if he could keep the paper, and Bush agreed. The congressional leaders quickly returned to the Capitol with Mitchell calling his aides to arrange a press conference. He suspected what would happen when John Sununu called Newt Gingrich the House Minority Whip, but already in effective control of the Republican caucus. As longtime leader, Bob Michael's influence waned. Sununu attended a House Republican caucus, and Republicans called their own press conference, insisting that the Read My Lips pledge still applied, and whatever the president said wouldn't bind House Republicans. It was an act of rebellion that Bob Dole, Mitchell's Republican counterpart in the Senate, would never have countenanced. But Mitchell and the House Democrats got there first, and Mitchell had the piece of paper stating clearly that Bush had broken his pledge. Senator Jim Sasser of the Budget Committee said Mitchell called him during the return trip and he was exuberant. And I was exuberant too when he told me what had occurred. And I was particularly exuberant that he had it in writing. Bush then addressed the nation that evening, and Mitchell followed him, saying that Democratic leaders supported the president. Later, Mitchell decided he'd erred by not trying to tease out exactly what tax revenue increases meant. The problem, he said, was that while he'd agreed to tax increases, we weren't specific, and so we had another 4 months of terrible, rancorous debate over what increases and by how much. Mitchell was proud of that moment, and he reproduced the statement from the president in his memoir, and it became almost legendary to his staff. Bob Rosen was much blunter than Mitchell about how precarious the Democratic negotiating front had been. Early on, the House wanted to fold on this, and Mitchell and Sasser were adamant. They were not going to do this until the president eats his words, basically. While agreeing that the statement seriously eroded Bush's position with the Republicans, Rosen said it had to be done, and it really was done only because Mitchell and Sasser were relentless. Dick Gephardt agreed, saying, "George Mitchell of the three of us was the toughest and strongest and most steadfast in really facing the president down to get him to do what he knew he had to do." Naturally, John Sununu has quite a different view of what happened. In his memoir of the Bush presidency called The Quiet Man, which was published in 2015 after I'd completed the research for my book, he devotes a long chapter, more than 40 pages, to the budget agreement and calls it Read My Lips, the Budget Agreement of 1990. I will now diverge from the text of my book to present a synopsis of what Sununu says in his book. The lineup of negotiators, Darman, Brady, and Sununu for the White House and the congressional leaders, plays out pretty much as Mitchell presented it in interviews and his memoir. Sununu was clearly the anti-tax hawk among the group, and he says that the member of Bush's cabinet he was most closely aligned with was Vice President Dan Quayle. He opens his account by recalling Bush's speech to the Republican National Convention in August 1980, when he first said, "Read my lips, no new taxes," which Sununu said were 6 infamous words that dogged him throughout his presidency. And Sununu adds the detail that Dick Darman kept trying to take out that phrase, while speechwriter Peggy Noonan and, crucially, Bush's communications chief Roger Ailes, later, and until recently, the president of Fox News, insisted on keeping the phrase in. Yet Sununu was fine with the anti-tax pledge. He cites his experience as governor of New Hampshire, which, as most of you know, collects less state revenue per person than any other state, as the reason, he says, "I had been convinced there was not a single public budget that couldn't be cut by 5%. He doesn't provide any specifics about how this could be done in a state or federal budget, though he does double down on the statement, reporting that when he was in internal discussions within the administration, he said that the federal budget could easily be cut by 5%. Inflation was then running at about 4%, so the actual cuts would have been nearly 10%. Sununu acknowledges that Bush's initial budget in 1989 was essentially just a carryover from the Reagan administration, with deficits still rising, and that the initial strategy for 1990 was for a one-year budget that would cut spending but increase no taxes, and then work on a multi-year plan after the midterm 1990 elections, where Democrats might well increase their already commanding majorities in Congress. Mitchell and then the rest of the Democratic leadership rejected this approach, and Bush agreed to pursue a multi-year strategy. The other key voice early on was Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan, who told the administration that he would not cut interest rates, despite a weakening economy, until the President and Congress produced a responsible multi-year budget plan. About the June 26 meeting, Sununu says, contrary to what Mitchell assumed, that it was prepared in advance, by saying that Darman suggested it at the meeting and then drafted it on the spot. In fact, when Darman raised the possibility of offering a written draft, Sununu claims that Darman did so, quote, for some unexplainable reason, and that it was not something that he expected. Sununu says that when he saw the draft of the statement by the President, my preference was to crumple it up and swallow it on the spot. And now we return to my text, with a few additions from John Sununu here and there. While it seemed like a breakthrough, the statement by the President didn't galvanize the budget talks, which dragged on. Thinking a setting away from the Capitol might help, congressional leaders agreed to a budget summit at Andrews Air Force Base after Labor Day. Bush had earlier declined to use Camp David, the presidential retreat, for the same purpose. But most of the parties and all of the disputes came along with them. Mitchell pressed ahead, but there were distractions. Saddam Hussein's forces invaded Kuwait on August 2nd, shoring up Bush's popularity, which had been in decline since his defeat on capital gains, backing down on taxes, and the public perception that the administration was adrift. Bill Frenzel of Minnesota was the ranking Republican on the House Budget Committee, then serving the last of 10 terms when he encountered Mitchell at the Andrews Summit, and he found him a strong, if not dominant figure, saying, I was rather surprised at Mitchell's technical competence. He knew a great deal about the budget. Frenzel said the Andrews talks, while not the end of the process, were helpful. One of the problems was that we had literally dozens of supposed negotiators, but many of them were just part of the Greek chorus sitting in the background. People would come and go, telephones would ring. Thank God we didn't have cell phones back then. We didn't complete work, but we cleared a lot of brush down there. The Andrews episode had its comical aspects. Jim Sasser recalls some Republicans didn't even bother to even feign interest. He said Newt Gingrich didn't participate at all, just sat there and read a newspaper while the rest of us were around the big table trying to work out a budget. John Sununu, he said, put his feet up on a table, and I remember Senator Robert Byrd lecturing him that that was improper conduct. On October 2nd, the negotiators announced an agreement. House Leader Dick Gephardt said, Mitchell was critical in helping keep the Senate folks in line. He had some pretty strong characters in there to deal with, like Senator Byrd and others who really didn't want to do any of this. But George kept everyone moving in the right direction, and after a lot of fits and starts, we finally got something together. Meanwhile, Republicans were anxious about the approaching congressional elections, and Bush had come to realize that he needed a budget deal before a likely invasion of Kuwait. He was soon dispatching 200,000 troops, followed by 200,000 more. But Bob Rosen said Democrats were dismayed that Bush continued to rule out an income tax increase while renewing his push for a capital gains cut. This produced some of the $500 million package's odder elements, such as the excise tax on luxury goods, including yachts, expensive cars, and high-priced jewelry. But it was a deal, and the CBO said that it met budget targets. Alan Greenspan also said it met the Federal Reserve's requirements for easing interest rates. Newt Gingrich wasn't quitting, though. The theory behind the agreement was that it was bipartisan with unpleasant elements for both sides. Even without an income tax increase, Gingrich saw the increased revenues as a betrayal and began organizing against the bill. Despite the support of Republican leader Bob Michel, Speaker Foley, and Majority Leader Gephardt, the budget deal was defeated on October 5th, 254 to 179. At that point, House Democrats decided to use their majority to pass a bill more to their liking, while hoping Mitchell could convince Bush and Senate Republicans not to block it. The House adopted a new top income tax rate of 33% with a surtax for incomes above $1 million for an effective top rate of 36.3%. Mitchell, meanwhile, pushed the Andrews deal through the Senate in order to convene a House-Senate conference. The conference sped through the spending cuts and settled on a top income tax rate of 31%, plus increases in alcohol, tobacco, and gasoline taxes. The White House signed off. The House approved the agreement, 228 to 200, and the Senate, 54 to to 45. Bush signed it into law on November 5th. Newt Gingrich's first major political gambit backfired. Bill Frenzel, the House Republican budget negotiator, said the Republicans cut their own throats. He was impressed that there was any deal at all, and it was the last time the two parties worked cooperatively on a deficit reduction package, a quintessentially painful proceeding. The country and the Congress prospered as a result of that act, Frenzel said. The people who did the heavy negotiating did a splendid job. It was great for the country, and I keep praying for another one of those agreements. John Sununu in his memoir agrees that it was Gingrich who torpedoed the budget deal, and he says Gingrich abandoned his promise to support it when it was signed. He wrote that, "Perhaps Gingrich wasn't blatantly lying to us, he was lying to himself until the deal was done and then decided, after the fact, that it was a great opportunity to lift himself up as leader of the opposition." And Sununu says he came to believe that Gingrich did not want Bush to be reelected in 1992 because it would give him a better opportunity to advance his agenda in opposition to a Democratic president, which of course is exactly what happened. Senator Bob Kerrey, a Nebraska Democrat, thought that despite appearances, Bush and Mitchell had a special relationship during this period. President Bush got a lot of criticism for supporting a tax increase, but deserved a tremendous amount of praise, actually, bringing Democrats more toward the center, and in some cases center-right, with pay-as-you-go and other budget procedures you'd normally think of as coming from conservative Republicans. Democrat Bill Bradley, who was up for re-election, had seen a backlash in New Jersey after Governor Jim Florio, a Democrat, had raised taxes after his election in 1989. And Bradley was grateful when Mitchell gave him a pass on voting for the deal. Bradley told him a vote for it was death in New Jersey. After Bradley's narrow win, Mitchell called to say, "You were right. If you'd voted for it, you would have lost." Bradley said that while Mitchell was disappointed in his vote, he was always realistic. If you couldn't be with him and told him, he'd understand, and he'd always have 3 or 4 votes that he held back. In his memoir, Mitchell contrasted the 1990 budget agreement with what came later. "When measured against the needs of the country, it was a modest result," he wrote. "When measured against the difficulty of adopting anything that inflicts sacrifice on any segment of society, it was a significant accomplishment. I hoped that from the pain and bitterness of our experience, we all learned valuable lessons that we could apply to better effect in the future. But obviously, that didn't happen." Finally, there's a mythology of what happened between Bush and Mitchell. No less an ally of Mitchell than Maine lawyer and Mitchell associate Harold Pacius insists that his friend tricked the president into signing a tax increase, and we've had nothing but trouble from the Republicans about taxes ever since. Clearly, Bush had underestimated the difficulty the budget agreement would create for him among Republicans. He had an assertive primary challenger, Patrick Buchanan, 2 years later, whose entire strategy seemed to be reminding voters about the broken pledge. Alan Simpson, the Senate Republican whip, dismisses the idea that Mitchell ever employed trickery. "I've always said if you have integrity, nothing else matters, and that if you don't have integrity, nothing else matters." And that's George. He had that integrity. There wouldn't be anyone who in the end could say, "George Mitchell tricked me," or "he ran a fast one on me." And I can tell you, I know people like that. Maine Republican Senator Bill Cohen said the budget agreement's tax increase still resonates with Republicans. They saw it as a breach of faith, adding, "Bush did the right thing, but he paid for it." Asked directly recently, Mitchell said there was no trickery. If you go back and check the record, which I have, the Republicans were deeply split internally. Democratic senators such as Jim Sasser, Paul Sarbanes, Don Regal, and Weisfowler were effective in the floor debates, Mitchell said, in pointing out how regressive the tax package the Republicans had insisted on really was. You get a distribution that shows a huge tax cut for those at the very top and increases for everyone else. And as these distribution tables were coming up, the Republicans in Congress were panicking because of the midterm elections. That was the factor that drove things. John Sununu also agrees. He says that Budget Director Dick Darman's style and personality led many conservative members of Congress to conclude that Darman snookered George Bush into raising taxes, which Sununu says is wrong on several counts. And he concludes, Bush invariably set the agenda and made the decisions. All final decisions were made by George Bush. Democrat John Breaux of Louisiana said Mitchell's abilities often confounded the opposition, and did so in the budget negotiations. He was always strongly assertive, and he was also very smart. I wouldn't say how much smarter he was than the president, but there was no question that he knew the subject and could argue the merits on just about anything with clarity. And it was more than just political posturing or repeating what someone else had told him. Knowledge is a very powerful weapon in this city, and George had it. After Bush was defeated in November 1992 by Bill Clinton, Mitchell led another deficit reduction, which, like the 1990 plan, was intended to cut another $500 million from the federal deficit. This one was not bipartisan. Every Republican in the House and Senate opposed it, as did some Democrats. It passed the Senate only after Bob Kerrey, who favored more budget cuts instead of tax increases, but decided that they wouldn't be forthcoming, became the 51st vote in favor during the budget reconciliation process, one of the few Senate procedures not subject to filibuster. Later, the tax increases were widely seen as a decisive factor in the Democrats' loss of their House and Senate majorities in the 1994 congressional election, when Mitchell left office and Newt Gingrich became House Speaker. Bill Clinton knew that creating a budget that raised taxes and cut spending would harm him politically, as it did Bush, but he nonetheless took Mitchell's side on the issue despite having campaigned on the need for a middle-class tax cut. His thoughts about the budget deal are not on record, but Mitchell did hear from Roger Altman, the Deputy Treasury Secretary for Clinton, who wrote, "This is just a note to say how much I admired your handling of the reconciliation bill. It was really masterful. Were the lead in anyone else's hands, it wouldn't have passed." The Bush and Clinton budget agreements of 1990 and 1993 that George Mitchell brokered, in a word, worked. The economy began expanding, revenues increased, and by the end of the Clinton presidency, the federal budget recorded 2 years of surpluses, the first time that had happened since Lyndon Johnson presented his last budget to Congress in 1968. Yet shortly thereafter, George W. Bush pushed through a new round of tax cuts in 2001, with Vice President Dick Cheney casting the deciding vote. The deficits quickly reappeared, and they are still with us today. Thank you.
Wow.
Okay, so we can now accept questions from the audience.
Can you talk a little bit about Senator Mitchell's life after he left the Senate?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think George Mitchell is unique in several respects as a senator. One way he was unique, he was appointed to the Senate to replace his own political mentor, Ed Muskie. And this has excited a lot of controversy in Maine political services because some people think Muskie grooved the path for him. And all the evidence I could turn up, and it's in the book, is that that did not happen. In fact, Muskie really thought he'd appoint someone else. This was Governor Brennan. So Mitchell got the job on a bit of a fluke, and he is the only senator I can find who really rivaled his predecessor in accomplishments, that is not like a father-son team. It's really remarkable that these two senators from Maine had such a big influence for 40 years, really, in the U.S. Senate. I think it's unique. But the other way that George Mitchell is unique is what he did after the Senate. I mean, most senators leave the Senate and they retire. They go golf, they might run a law firm, they would do some things, but nothing major. This was not George Mitchell's plan. Now, how much of a plan he had after leaving the Senate is a little obscure because, in immediate terms, he didn't know what he was going to do. A lot of people thought he would become the next commissioner of Major League Baseball. And in fact, he came close to being offered that job, but it did not happen. What he did do, and this goes back to the fact that he actually turned down an appointment to the Supreme Court, this does not happen very often, by Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton clearly really wanted George Mitchell to serve on the Supreme Court as part of his own legacy as president, but Mitchell said no. He did not want to do that. did not want to go back to the federal bench, which he had come from when he joined the Senate. So Clinton then asked him, well, would you consider something else? And he said yes. So the something else, in that case, turned out to be leading the Irish peace talks, which is another talk that I've delivered twice so far, and is a fascinating story in itself. It wasn't exactly a presidential appointment. It eventually took an appointment by the British and the Irish governments to this post, but it's a very unusual situation for a negotiator from another country to come in and broker a peace agreement in a third country. Has not worked very well in the Middle East, for instance. But in this one instance, it really did work. And Mitchell spent 2.5 years talking to Irish people and British people about a peace agreement that many people thought would never happen, but it did. So that was, in the immediate post-Senate years, that was his big accomplishment. But in the meantime, he went back and he was a law partner with Bob Dole, his former Senate counterpart from the Republican side, and he built that law firm with the help of others into a real powerhouse law firm. DLA Piper, which is the firm that he is now chairman emeritus of, has 3,900 attorneys in I think something like 35 different countries. It's a worldwide law firm. It's one of the first truly international law firms anywhere, and it is still the largest law firm in the world. So he spent a great deal of time there, and that became his base for further operations, which included a lot of different things. One of the more interesting ones was when he went on the Walt Disney Company board. At the time, the board was having a huge conflict with Michael Eisner, who was like the creative genius and really the financial genius of Disney, but had really come into serious conflict with some of the board members. And Mitchell ended up taking over as president of the company in order to really negotiate that process, which led to the peaceful departure of Michael Eisner and the continued flourishing of the Disney company. So that was an achievement in the business world that, again, few people thought he could pull off. And there have been other things. I mean, he continues to be very active. A lot of people know about his diplomacy in the Middle East, which in that case did not lead to an agreement. I would argue, even though I'm his biographer, it was not really his fault. The conditions, unlike in Ireland, were not right for an agreement in the Middle East when he was there. But I think there's probably still one more act in George Mitchell's public life. He's 83 years old, but he's a very healthy, very active 83, and I think he may still have something left to do. I don't know what it is. I'm not sure he does either, but I think there might be just one more. But thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Do we have other things we would like to talk about?
Are you two all set?
I think I'm good. I'm wondering, I mean, he is such a unique and capable person. I don't know his children and grandchildren. Has anybody else sort of followed his path within his own family?
His children?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yes, he does have one grandchild now. Yeah. Well, his family life was complicated. Dan and I were talking about this just before the talk. He married fairly young. His first wife was named Sally Heath, and she was from Concord, New Hampshire. She had actually worked in 2 political offices in New Hampshire, I believe, the elder Governor Gregg and Stiles Bridges in the Senate office. But she didn't like politics. It was she worked in a political office, but she decided she didn't like politics. So she moved to Washington, and I think she was working for a federal agency, not a political position. And George Mitchell met her outside the Catholic Church, where they were both going to church in Georgetown. He was going to law school. She was working for the federal government. They fell in love and married. But at that time, George Mitchell didn't have any political ambitions. We have some pictures in the back of his early days with Ed Muskie. He literally was called out of the blue by Muskie's chief of staff, Don Nickel, and said, we know you're from Waterville, which is where Ed Muskie had his law practice. He said, we know you're from Waterville, you come from a good family, would you be interested in talking to us? I mean, that simply, George Mitchell went to work for Ed Muskie as his number 2 guy in the office, and he then got a real taste for politics. Now, unfortunately, his wife Sally never really reacquired any taste for politics. She became a very shy and somewhat reclusive person as time went on. She did appear with him during his 1982 Senate campaign, when it was recognized it was really important that he have his entire family around him. And she did do some limited campaigning in 1982, but she really did not like it. And when it became clear that he was going to run for another term in the Senate in 1988, at that point they decided to divorce. So he was divorced in 1987. He was single throughout the period that he was Senate Majority Leader. And they had one daughter together. Her name is Andrea. She's a social worker. I've never met her, but she still lives in Maine, in the Portland area. But toward the end of his year as a Senate Majority Leader, he met Heather McLaughlin, who was on the pro tennis tour for women. It was an interesting job. She was the first professional director that the women's tour had ever had, and very good at her job, apparently. So anyway, they met at the US Open tennis tournament and fell in love very quickly and decided to get married. So it was about that time that George Mitchell announced that he would not be returning to the Senate. He was going to leave and raise a family. So he has 2 children with his second wife. Andrew is kind of a famous guy because Mitchell dedicated the Irish peace agreement to his son Andrew. And the daughter is named Claire, which also has a connection to the Ireland talks because she was named for a woman who was injured in a bombing there and yet became a witness for peace and really moved people in Ireland to support the peace agreement. So they have 2 kids. I think Andrew is attending college this year, and they're doing well. And Andrea has 1 child. So he has a small family. Pardon?
So we'll see in terms of.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. I mean, he comes from a very large family, and it's kind of interesting the way families work. He had 4 surviving siblings, and they produced within 2 generations 39 great-grandchildren for the Mitchell, for George's parents. So it was a very large family, very active family politically, and just great people. I've interviewed most of them, certainly the older generation. And you can kind of see how important his family really is to him and how important family continues to be to George Mitchell. I mean, he says, at the time he said his marriage didn't have an effect on his decision to leave the Senate, but since then he's pretty much admitted that it did have an effect. So yes, his family life is interesting and important to understanding who he is.
Douglas, thank you so much. I
Well,
appreciate
thank you,
you
Dan.
coming to Water Street Bookstore.
I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you.